The fluorescent lights hummed like diesel generators, and nobody at Mercy General knew that the woman restocking 4 bags in the supply closet had once performed field surgeries in Baghdad with rounds going through the tent above her head. Danielle Ross moved through the ER corridors like she was invisible. 3 years at Mercy General, and that invisibility had become her armor. She restocked plasma, checked expiration dates, organized the trauma cart with hands that had done this in sandstorms, under fire, with sirens that sounded like dying children. Now the sirens meant something different. Now they made her flinch. Her navy jacket hung in locker 47. The faded 3rd Special Forces Group Unit patch was sewn carefully into the lining, hidden where no one looked. 16 stitches, done by hand at 2 in the morning in a quiet moment that would never come again. She hadn't worn the patch openly in 4 years. Didn't need to. The woman she'd been, Senior Chief Petty Officer, lived in the past tense now. In this life, she was just Danielle. Just a nurse. The morning shift started at 6:47. Danielle arrived at 6:30, like she always did, before the chaos, before the doctors, before anyone could ask her name or watch too closely. The ER smelled like antiseptic and something underneath it, old blood that bleach couldn't quite reach, copper and salt. She knew that smell. She'd worn it on her skin once. At 6:52, a resident named Marcus wheeled a crash cart past her. He nodded. She nodded back. That was the entire conversation. Marcus was a Marine, judging by the way he moved, shoulders squared, no wasted motion. He probably knew what she was. They always did. The ones who'd been places. The ones who understood that the quietest person in the room might have seen the worst. Dr. Harrison Hargrove swept into the ER at 7:03, coffee in one hand, tablet in the other, his navy suit tailored to a $4,000 precision that said, "Country Club this weekend." He was the kind of man who measured success in insurance metrics and efficiency ratings. Patients per hour. Revenue per treatment. Time optimized down to 15-minute increments. He'd been the senior attending for 6 years, climbing toward chief of staff, and he had no use for nurses who asked questions or spent extra time with patients. Danielle was preparing the medication cart when Hargrove passed by. She felt his eyes on her for exactly 2 seconds, the amount of time it took him to assess whether she was useful or in the way. She kept her hands moving. Propofol. Midazolam. Fentanyl. Each vial in its place, each movement efficient and quiet. Ms. Ross. Not a greeting. An acknowledgement of her existence, barely. Doctor. She didn't look up. Didn't smile. Just continued working. That was the protocol. Keep your head down. Don't make eye contact. Don't remind them that you exist at a level they might not understand. It was easier that way. Safer. What Hargrove didn't see was the way she'd positioned herself so she could reach 3 different crash cart locations in under 20 seconds. He didn't see the calculation in her movements, the muscle memory that had saved 47 lives in 2 deployments. He didn't see the thin white scars on her forearms that looked like shrapnel burns because they were. He didn't see the woman who could perform a pericardiocentesis, a needle straight through the chest wall into the pericardium to drain blood from around a failing heart, in the back of a Black Hawk while it banked hard over Helmand Province. He saw a nurse who restocked for bags and stayed out of his way. That was enough for him. By 8:15, the ER was moving. An 84-year-old with chest pain. A child with a fractured arm. A woman in labor. The usual controlled chaos, the kind of morning where Danielle could disappear into the work and nobody would look at her twice. She moved between rooms, between patients, between crises with the kind of fluid precision that made other nurses seem clumsy by comparison. She was, in her own way, a kind of apex predator, not because she wanted to be, but because she couldn't help it. Hargrove watched her work. He watched the way she inserted a peripheral line into a patient's vein without causing bruising. The way she anticipated crash cart needs before doctors asked for them. The way she moved a combative patient from thrashing to compliance by speaking in low tones and positioning herself at a 45-degree angle to their line of sight. De-escalation. Presence. Authority warned so quietly it looked like deference. That bothered him. At 8:47, the radio crackled. Incoming, male, 41 years old, hearing impaired, severe anxiety, ETA 4 minutes. Hargrove was charting in his office when the call came through. He marked it down, another patient, another 15-minute slot, and made a note in his system. Efficiency. Movement. Next. When the patient arrived, his name was Victor. He was deaf. Completely deaf. Born that way, his sister explained, who'd ridden in the ambulance and was now clutching his arm. Victor had served 14 years in the army. Combat medic. 3 tours in Iraq. He'd come to the ER because his chest felt tight and his heart was racing and he didn't know if he was dying, and he was terrified, and nobody in the ambulance had a way to communicate with him except to yell, which made everything worse. His vitals were bad. Blood pressure elevated. Heart rate 123. Respiratory rate climbing. Panic attack or cardiac event, they didn't know yet, and they needed him to stay still for the EKG. Hargrove assigned the case to Danielle with a quick wave. Get him stable. 20-minute maximum for baseline workup. The imaging queue is backed up all morning. 20 minutes. For a deaf man having a panic attack to understand what was happening, to trust the process, to calm down enough for his autonomic nervous system to release the adrenaline strangling his heart. Danielle didn't argue. Didn't say it was impossible. She just nodded and walked into the room. Victor's sister saw her first. He can't hear you, she started, defensive and frightened. You have to write things down or... I know, Danielle said quietly. And she did. She pulled up her phone, opened YouTube, typed 3 words into the search bar, basic sign language tutorial. The first video was 8 minutes long. She hit play. Then she looked at Victor and started moving her hands. F-like-N-E. Are you fine? Can I help you? The signs were rough, unpracticed, almost painful to watch. Her hands had done 1,000 things, cut through skin and muscle, clamped arteries, held organs in place while helicopters shook around her. Now they moved slowly, deliberately, trying to form the shape of communication. Victor watched her. His shoulders began to drop. She pointed to the EKG machine. She made a motion with her hands, explained without words what they were going to do. She showed him the pads. Put them on her own chest first to show they wouldn't hurt. Then she helped him lie back, placed them on his skin, and he didn't flinch. His vital signs began to trend down. BP 116. Heart rate 108. Respiratory rate evening out. Danielle kept signing. I am here. You are safe. We will figure this out together. The signs felt like speaking a language she'd once known and forgotten. Like muscle memory from a lifetime she'd left behind. 8 minutes passed. 10. 12. At the 15-minute mark, his sister was crying, and Victor was breathing normally, and the EKG came back normal, and everything was fine. Danielle had spent 18 minutes calming a deaf veteran instead of moving to the next patient on the list. Hargrove stood outside the room, watching through the window, checking his watch. 17 minutes. 18. His jaw tightened. He pulled out his phone. In the nurse's station, at 8:58, Hargrove announced it loud enough for everyone to hear, I'm going to make a bet. $20 says our good Samaritan in room for quits within a week. Anyone taking action? 4 nurses looked up. Nobody answered immediately. It was the kind of bet that was also a threat, a way of saying, I see you being soft, I see you wasting my time, I see you not fitting into the system I've built. The system was efficient. The system was clean. The system didn't allow for 18 minutes spent on one patient's emotional needs when the queue had 17 others waiting. Danielle heard it from the medication room, where she was organizing vials. She didn't stop. Didn't flinch. Didn't even pause. Just kept working. The room was quiet except for the fluorescent light's endless electric hum. A young nurse named Claire, fresh out of residency, shifted uncomfortably. "That's not really fair, Dr. Hargrove." She got him stable. "Within protocol." Hargrove smiled. It was the smile of a man who knew he was right. "What's the maximum time per patient according to the efficiency matrix?" 15 minutes, Claire said quietly. "Exactly." He took a sip of coffee and walked away, still smiling. In the medication room, Danielle finished organizing the vials. Her hands were completely steady. The trembling that rose in her chest, that wasn't fear. It was restraint. It was the same pressure she'd felt 1,000 times before, the kind that came from holding everything down, from keeping the warrior in a locked box, from being invisible and safe and small. She took one measured breath. Then another. Then she walked back to her patients and continued her shift like nothing had happened, moving through Mercy General like she was a ghost, like she'd never been there at all. But what Hargrove didn't know was that Victor had been watching when Danielle signed those words, and his sister had explained what the signs meant, and Victor had recognized something in the way she moved. The precision. The calm. The hands of someone who understood crisis the way most people understand breathing. And Victor was about to make a phone call that would change everything. But not yet. Not for a few more hours. For now, Danielle Ross restocked her supplies and waited for the next patient and kept her invisible armor firmly in place, unaware that the countdown had already begun. The next morning, Danielle arrived 30 minutes early, as she always did. The ER was still quiet, that blessed window before the chaos, before the phone started ringing and the ambulances began their wailing descent on the loading dock. She was restocking the medication cart near the nurse's station when Dr. Hargrove swept in, already showered and pressed in his white coat, already radiating the kind of confidence that came from never having his authority questioned. He gathered 5 nurses and 2 residents around the station like a maestro commanding an orchestra. His voice carried across the ER with calculated projection, not quite loud enough to seem unprofessional, but loud enough that everyone within 20 feet heard every word. "I'll bet anyone here $20 that our little son quits within a week," he announced, his smile the kind that predators wore before feeding. "Some people think patient care is about feelings instead of efficiency. They learn better after a reality check." He laughed. A few residents chuckled nervously. The nurses avoided eye contact, suddenly very interested in their computer screens and supply drawers. Danielle walked past him carrying a stack of patient charts, her face smooth as glass. She didn't pause. Didn't acknowledge. Didn't break stride. But she heard him. Everyone heard him. The words were meant to land, and they did, just not where he expected. He wanted anger. He wanted tears. He wanted her to shrivel under the weight of public humiliation the way the other nurses did, the way he'd learned people typically responded to having their value questioned in front of their peers. She gave him nothing. That afternoon, the cafeteria was crowded with the lunch rush, nurses between shifts, residents stealing 15 minutes, orderlies moving through the crowd like schools of fish navigating a current. Danielle carried her tray carefully, soup, salad, water. She'd learned early to eat light and fast. You never knew when a trauma would come through those doors, when you'd need your hands free and your mind sharp. Hargrove was waiting by the beverage station. He turned as she passed, and his elbow came up in what might have been described as accidental if anyone had been naive enough to believe in accidents. His arm caught hers just hard enough. The tray tipped. Soup splashed across the tile in a dark, spreading stain. The plastic bowl clattered and rolled. 50 people turned to stare. "Careful there, sweetheart," Hargrove said, his smile widening. His voice was honey and poison. "Wouldn't want you hurting yourself." Danielle took one measured breath. Just one. She felt the heat rise through her chest, felt it climb her neck and spread across her face like wildfire, felt the ancient animal part of her brain that had been trained for 18 years in close quarters and high-stress environments register the aggression, catalog the threat, prepare a response. But her voice, when she spoke, was quiet. Controlled. Each word a carefully placed stone. "I've carried heavier things than cafeteria trays, doctor." She knelt to clean it up, using paper towels from her pocket, moving with the practiced efficiency of someone who'd cleaned up far worse than spilled soup. Hargrove watched her, his satisfaction radiating like heat. He'd scored a point. He'd made her kneel. In his mind, he'd won. But something flickered across his face when she looked up, just for an instant, barely perceptible, the moment a predator realizes it might have misjudged its prey. Then his smile returned, and he moved on. That evening, he escalated. It was shift change, the moment when the station was busiest, when every nurse and resident was processing handoffs and reviewing orders and preparing for the next 12 hours. Danielle was reviewing a patient's updated labs when Hargrove appeared with a patient chart in his hand. He held it for exactly long enough for her to see it, then dropped it at her feet. The paper scattered across the tile like autumn leaves. "Pick that up, sweetheart," he said, his voice smooth as silk and twice as dangerous. His smile was a blade. "Let's see if you can follow simple instructions." The charge nurse stared at her shoes. Two residents suddenly became fascinated with their phones. A single tear escaped down Danielle's cheek. She didn't look away. She wiped it without breaking eye contact, her jaw tight enough to crack, her hand steady as she bent to gather the papers. The tear had come unbidden, not from shame, not from hurt, but from the pressure of 18 years of carrying things that couldn't be set down. 18 years of watching men break under the weight of responsibility that should have crushed them both, of moving through the dark places of the world with the knowledge that one mistake meant someone died. 18 years of being invisible because visibility meant being questioned, being studied, being asked why a woman could do what men struggled with. She finished gathering the papers. When she straightened, her voice was quiet enough to cut through the entire station. "I've carried heavier things than your ego, doctor." Hargrove's smile froze. It didn't fade gradually, it simply stopped, like a light switch flipped. His eyes narrowed. The charge nurse's breath caught. One of the residents actually stepped backward. The fluorescent lights overhead buzzed their electronic hymn into the silence. Danielle set the papers back on the counter, each sheet careful and precise, and returned to her work as if the man standing 3 feet away didn't exist. Her hands didn't shake. Her breathing stayed even. The mask settled back into place like a well-worn glove, and she was invisible again, or at least, she appeared to be. That night, as Danielle finished her shift and changed out of her scrubs, she caught her reflection in the locker room mirror. The woman looking back wasn't the timid nurse Hargrove thought he'd broken. There was something else there now, something that had been asleep for 3 years and was beginning to stir. 2 days later, Corporal Marcus Hayes was admitted to Mercy General with a kidney stone that didn't warrant hospital admission but required pain management the ER could provide. He was medically retired, 2 years out, construction work now, with a kind of permanent limp that came from an IED in Sanjan Valley and the kind of eyes that never quite stopped scanning rooms for threats. He was being processed for discharge when a nurse came to insert a central line into a morbidly obese patient in the next bed over, a difficult procedure because the landmarks were buried beneath tissue and finding the vein required more than just knowledge, it required intuition that came from doing this hundreds of times in conditions that would make most people's hands shake. Hayes watched Danielle work. She moved with the fluid precision of someone who'd done this in dust storms and artillery fire, in vehicles moving at speed over broken terrain, in forward operating bases where there were no surgeons and no backup plans and no room for hesitation. She prepped the site with ultrasound guidance, found the subclavian vein, and then did something that made Hayes's breath catch in his throat. She advanced the needle with a slight rotation of the wrist, a subtle movement that appeared almost casual unless you knew what you were looking at. That rotation prevented arterial puncture in moving vehicles. That rotation was taught only to Special Forces combat medics in the 160th SAW pipeline and the JSOC direct action medical courses. His mouth opened. Her face remained carefully blank, practiced invisibility perfected over years, but her hands moved with the kind of muscle memory that couldn't be faked. The line threaded smoothly. The blood draw confirmed placement. She secured it with the efficiency of someone who'd inserted hundreds of lines, and then she moved to the next patient without acknowledgement, without eye contact, without anything that would draw attention to what had just happened. Hayes sat very still. He'd seen that technique once before, in a classified briefing about Special Forces medical capabilities, in a video that showed the 3 medics who'd conducted emergency surgery on a CIA asset in Baghdad, the ones who'd prevented the intelligence loss that kept an entire region from destabilizing. The video was 14 minutes long and showed 3 pairs of hands, never their faces, never any identifying information except their uniforms and their unit patches. One of those medics had a scar across the back of her left hand. Hayes watched Danielle hand off her gloves, and as she reached for the trash, her sleeve pulled back just enough. A scar. The same scar. The same shape. The same location. He said nothing, but his eyes followed her the rest of the shift, and for the first time since leaving the service, Corporal Marcus Hayes felt like he was being shown something he wasn't supposed to see, being given knowledge that was going to change the configuration of his entire world. What happened next would prove him right. 2 days later, at 4:53 p.m., the ambulance bay doors exploded open. The stretcher came through like a missile, a 17-year-old named Tyler Brennan, ribs crushed, steering column embedded in his chest cavity, a drunk driver's T-bone collision rewriting the geometry of a boy's body in 3 seconds. The paramedic was already shouting, "Crush injury, penetrating trauma, BP dropping, we're looking at cardiac tamponade, ETA was 10 minutes ago." Hargrove appeared from the back office before the wheels even stopped rolling. He moved like a man who'd been waiting for this, an opportunity to remind everyone why he was chief attending, why his name carried weight, why a reckless nurse with delusions of heroism didn't belong in his ER. He positioned himself at the head of the stretcher with the precision of someone who'd choreographed this moment 1,000 times in his mind. Trauma Bay 1. Get me a surgical team. Now. His voice carried the tone of a man accustomed to obedience, a man whose authority had never been questioned, whose decisions had never been second-guessed. The nurses scattered. The resident froze, reaching for his phone. Hargrove's eyes were already calculating, already running the math that every trauma surgeon understands, a chest full of blood, a heart that can't pump, minutes disappearing like sand through an hourglass. Call up to OR. I want them standing by. Tell them we've got a tamponade, possible hemothorax, and the surgical team won't arrive for 35 minutes. 35 minutes. The words hung in the fluorescent lit air like a death sentence. Everyone in that bay understood what those numbers meant. A human body can only compensate for so long before the mathematics turn lethal. Tyler's oxygen sat at 74%. His heart rate had climbed to 168, desperate, a motor redlining in its final moments. His blood pressure was a whisper, 82/50 and dropping like a stone down a well. Danielle had been charting in the corner of the trauma bay when the ambulance alert came through. She'd stayed after her shift, 3 hours past when she should have left, because there were patients who needed her presence, needed someone who understood that medicine wasn't about efficiency metrics or insurance-friendly hierarchies. She was wearing her jacket, the navy blue one with a faded unit patch sewn inside the lining, a cloth reminder of who she used to be, who she'd been trying very hard not to be. She'd been about to leave. She'd been about to walk out those doors and go home to her daughter and pretend that Dr. Hargrove's contempt didn't matter, that his public humiliation didn't register, that his bet about her quitting within a week wasn't already burrowing into her thoughts like an infection. But that wasn't the worst part. The worst part was that she understood, with the clarity of someone who'd held dying men's chests open in a Baghdad surgical tent, that Tyler Brennan was about to die. Not in 35 minutes when a surgical team finally arrived. Now. In the next 8 to 12 minutes, his blood pressure would drop below 60. His heart would fibrillate. His body would begin its descent into irreversible shock. The math was simple. The outcome was certain. Unless someone did something that nobody in this room except Danielle Ross was trained to do. She watched Hargrove bark more orders. She watched him move with the confidence of a man whose competence had never been tested against actual failure. She watched him check his watch, a Rolex with a gold band, the kind of watch that announced its owner's status in a language the hospital understood. He was already mentally preparing his conversation with the surgical team, already composing the explanation he would give about how he'd done everything possible, how sometimes even the best medicine isn't enough, how it was tragic but unavoidable. Danielle looked at Tyler. The boy's eyes were already changing. Pupils dilating. The subtle shift that happened when a young nervous system understood, even if his conscious mind didn't, that it was running out of time. She'd seen that look before. She'd seen it in the face of a 19-year-old Marine in Fallujah. She'd seen it in the eyes of a translator in Sanjan Valley. She'd seen it enough times that her body recognized the pattern faster than thought. She moved before her mind had finished deciding. Her jacket came off in one smooth motion. She crossed the trauma bay in 3 steps. 18-gauge needle. Sterile field. Now. Hargrove's head swiveled toward her. His expression shifted from command to something darker, something that looked like a man watching a subordinate reach for authority that didn't belong to her. Excuse me. Needle. Chest. Pericardiocentesis. Danielle's voice had changed. It wasn't the deferential tone she used when addressing the hospital hierarchy. It wasn't the soft cadence of a nurse asking permission. This was the voice of someone who'd given orders in rooms where hesitation cost lives. We don't have 35 minutes. We have 8. Hargrove stepped toward her. His face had flushed the color of beet juice. You are not authorized to. She didn't answer. She was already holding the needle. She'd watched the nurses assemble the equipment 3 seconds after she'd asked. They understood. Maybe they'd heard something in her voice that made them move without questioning. Maybe they'd seen something in her eyes that confirmed she knew exactly what she was doing. The boy's chest was already prepped. Sterile technique was already in place. The room had shifted around her without her asking twice. Danielle's hands moved with the terrifying precision of muscle memory responding to a crisis it had trained for across 3 combat tours and 847 emergency field procedures. She located the 5th intercostal space, the angle of her approach, the exact trajectory that would slide the needle through skin and muscle and pericardial sac without perforating the atrial wall. In Baghdad, she'd done this with mortars landing close enough that dust fell from the tent ceiling. She'd done this while a helicopter's rotor wash shook the surgical table. She'd done this with hands covered in blood that wasn't hers. This time, her hands were steady as a surgical laser. This time, the room was silent. The needle went in. The hiss of air escaping as pressure released. The sudden flood of bloody fluid into the collection syringe, dark red, the color of catastrophe, the color of a boy's heart drowning in its own pericardial sac. She withdrew 47 milliliters in steady pulls, watching Tyler's oxygen saturation climb, 74, 81, 87, 92. Watching his blood pressure stabilize, 82 becoming 94 becoming 104. Watching the heart monitor's rhythm transform from the chaotic desperation of tamponade back into something that resembled sinus rhythm, something that resembled survival. The entire procedure took 4 minutes. Nobody in that room moved except Danielle. When she withdrew the needle, Tyler's eyes were still wide, but different now. Still afraid, but alive with the particular terror of a 17-year-old who understood he'd been inches from death. His oxygen was holding at 94%. His heart rate was 118, elevated but no longer in the desperate red zone. His blood pressure had stabilized at 108/67. He was still critical. He still needed surgery. He still needed everything that Hargrove had already called for. But he needed those things now as a living boy, not as a cadaver requiring an explanation to his parents. Danielle set the needle on the sterile field. She stepped back. She didn't look at Hargrove. She should have looked at him. Because the expression on his face in that moment was the kind of thing a person only gets to see once, the kind of moment when a man's world reconfigures in real time. His eyes had gone white around the irises. His jaw had clenched so tight she could see the muscle twitching at the hinge of it. And there was something else, something that looked like recognition, like he'd just understood something fundamental about the hierarchy in his own emergency room, and the understanding was eating him from the inside. "Get him to OR," Danielle said, her voice settling back into something almost professional, almost deferential. But not quite. There was something different in the timbre now. Something that hadn't been there before. "He'll need thoracic surgery for the penetrating trauma, but the tamponade is resolved. He's stable for transport." The surgical team was already mobilizing. They'd heard her. They'd seen her. They understood that whatever credentials or authority structure existed on paper, there was someone in this room who could do something the rest of them couldn't. Hargrove was still frozen, his mouth open in a way that suggested words were trying to form but couldn't find a path into the world. Tyler disappeared toward the elevator, toward OR, toward whatever came next in a life that would have ended if a quiet nurse had continued being quiet. Danielle pulled her jacket back on. The unit patch pressed against her ribs, hidden again, contained again, secret again. She didn't say anything to Hargrove. She didn't make eye contact. She simply moved back to where she'd been charting, picked up her clipboard, and signed out her patients with the precision of someone who'd just saved a boy's life and had already moved on to the next thing. But Hargrove didn't move. He stood in the middle of the trauma bay, surrounded by the ordinary chaos of an ER that had just witnessed something extraordinary, and his hands were trembling. Not from adrenaline. Not from the speed of crisis response. Those hands were trembling with something colder than fear. Something closer to rage. The kind of rage that doesn't dissipate. The kind of rage that compounds, that festers, that plots. He pulled out his phone. His fingers were shaking as he typed. Danielle saw him message someone, probably Strickland, the board chairman, the golfing buddy. Probably something that started with, "We need to talk. Now." What happened next would confirm what Dr. Hargrove had already begun to understand. He'd made a catastrophic error in judgment. He'd picked a fight with someone whose competence existed in a dimension he couldn't touch, whose authority came from somewhere that didn't show up on an organizational chart, whose quiet refusal to be intimidated had just saved a child's life in front of an entire emergency department. And he was going to burn everything trying to make her pay for the humiliation of being shown up. Within 4 hours of the boy's gasping breath returning to normal, of his oxygen saturation climbing back to 96%, of that sinus rhythm stabilizing on the monitor like a heartbeat refusing to quit, Dr. Hargrove made his first call. His office door closed. His fingers dialed Gerald Strickland, the board chairman, a man he'd golfed with every third Saturday for 7 years. The conversation lasted exactly 9 minutes. Hargrove's voice was steady, controlled, the tone of a professional reporting a threat. He didn't shout. He didn't accuse. He framed it differently. A nurse performed an invasive cardiac procedure without authorization, without physician oversight, without even notifying me until the needle was already in the patient's chest. He paused, let the silence work. The boy survived. Yes. But protocol exists for a reason, Gerald. Insurance liability, credential verification, lawful scope of practice. What happens next time? What happens when a nurse decides to operate outside her lane and a patient dies? Who's liable? Who faces the lawsuit? Strickland, a man who understood risk the way accountants understood red ink, was already listening. Hargrove continued, his voice dropping, becoming conspiratorial. "I think there's a credentialing issue here. Background might not be clean. I'm going to need to review how she was hired." For hours. The machinery was already moving. By 6 that evening, Hargrove had contacted 3 of Danielle's former supervisors from her previous hospital positions, from the clinics where she'd worked before Mercy General. To each one, he posed the same careful question: "We're doing a routine credentialing audit. Can you confirm that Danielle Ross held the certification she claimed on her application?" And before they could answer, he added the hook, the suggestion that made their guard drop. We're concerned there may have been some misrepresentation on the initial paperwork. A misrepresentation. A falsification. The word hung there, unspoken but clear. One supervisor hesitated, then said, her work was always exceptional. Beyond exceptional. I never questioned her credentials. Hargrove's response was smooth as oil. That's what we're trying to understand. Thank you. By the time he hung up, the seed was planted. Credentialing issues. Potential fraud. A nurse operating outside her scope. The facts didn't matter anymore. The narrative mattered. The story that could be told to the board, to lawyers, to insurance companies. By Wednesday morning, Hargrove had brought in an external investigator, a woman named Patricia Kozlov from a firm that specialized in healthcare compliance audits. She was thorough, efficient, and motivated by billable hours. She pulled Danielle's hiring file, her application, her submitted certifications. She requested records from every hospital, every clinic. She called references again, this time with a different tone, more official, asking pointed questions. How would you rate her adherence to protocols? Were there ever concerns about her performing procedures outside her job description? Did she ever strike you as someone willing to bend rules? The questions were designed to harvest doubt. By Thursday afternoon, Kozlov sent Hargrove an email with the subject line, preliminary findings. Her tone was neutral, but her conclusion was clear, no evidence of credential falsification. All certifications verified. However, documentation suggests a pattern of independent clinical decision-making that may warrant review by credentialing committee. Translation, I found nothing, but I prepared a structure for you to fire her anyway. That evening at 5:47, Danielle received a text message. Report to HR tomorrow morning, 8 a.m. Do not clock in for your shift. She read it 3 times, her chest tightening. She didn't need explanations. She'd been in enough debriefs to read between the lines. The machinery had moved fast. Faster than she'd expected. By 6 p.m., she was sitting at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee that had gone cold 40 minutes ago, the official suspension notice in front of her, printed on letterhead that felt heavier than it should have. The letter detailed breach of protocol, unauthorized medical procedures, potential patient endangerment. Each phrase was precisely chosen, legally defensible, designed to sound reasonable while being absolutely lethal. Her hands didn't shake as she read it. The tremor she felt was deeper than fear. It was the sound of an entire identity collapsing in on itself. The tears came silently, without warning, without performance. They fell onto the kitchen table like a rhythm she couldn't interrupt, and she didn't try to stop them. Not because she'd lost a job. She'd lost jobs before. She'd lost countries before. But that wasn't what broke her. What broke her was the loss of the invisibility, the careful architecture of silence she'd constructed over 7 years at Mercy General. She'd been so meticulous. So careful. She'd kept her head down, smiled at the right moments, asked permission before acting, deferred to doctors even when they were wrong, built a second identity so solid that nobody had questioned who she was. And in 40 minutes of work, 18 minutes of learning sign language, 22 minutes of saving a life, she'd shattered it completely. The coffee was cold. The letter was real. The game was over. The door opened, and Emma stood in the doorway, still in her school uniform, her backpack slung over one shoulder. She was supposed to be at Riley's house until 6:30. Something had changed plans. Her eyes found her mother at the kitchen table, found the tears, and her face transformed into something younger than 14. Mom? Why are you home early? Her voice was small, confused, the voice of someone whose safe world had just tilted. Danielle couldn't answer. Not with truth. Not with the words that would explain that the Navy had tracked her down through a unit patch in her locker, that the woman Emma knew as a nurse who worked extra shifts was actually someone else entirely, that the entire foundation of their lives was about to shift. She couldn't say, your mother was fired for saving a life. She couldn't say, people found out who I used to be. She couldn't say anything that wasn't a lie or a half-truth, and she was so tired of half-truths. She just shook her head. Emma dropped her backpack and crossed the kitchen, moving toward her mother with the certainty of a child who still believed physical proximity could fix breaking things. Danielle pulled her close, and the embrace lasted longer than Emma was prepared for, her arms around her mother's shoulders, confused about what she was comforting. "Did something happen at work?" Emma asked, her voice muffled against Danielle's neck. "Did they say something mean to you again?" "Again?" As if the hospital staff's dismissal of her, the way doctors ignored her recommendations, the way her experience was treated as irrelevance, was a known pattern that Emma had absorbed through years of observation. Danielle pulled back enough to look at her daughter's face. 13 years old, intelligent eyes, completely unaware that the woman holding her had once performed emergency surgery in a sandstorm with mortars falling 3 kilometers away. "I don't work there anymore, baby." The words came out flat, exhausted. Emma's eyes widened. "Did they fire you?" "For what?" "For saving a life. For stepping outside the lane Dr. Hargrove wanted her to stay in. For letting someone see the woman underneath the nurse uniform. For being good enough that it threatened him. For doing my job," Danielle said quietly. The weekend that followed moved in grey silence, time sliding forward without markers. Danielle updated her resume on a laptop at the kitchen table, updating certifications that were real but carefully curated to hide their context. She didn't mention special forces. She didn't mention the unit patch. She constructed a work history that showed competence without raising questions, a nursing career that was impressive but explainable, a background that no interview would dig deeper into. She avoided Emma's questions with responses that were technically honest but wholly unhelpful. "Are you going to get another job?" "Probably." "When?" "Soon." "At another hospital?" "Maybe." Emma stopped asking by Sunday evening. Danielle's phone rang 4 times. Corporal Hayes' number appeared on the screen each time. She stared at the phone each time it rang, watching the notification appear and disappear, and didn't answer. She had no idea how he'd gotten her cell number. She didn't want to know. She'd spent 7 years making sure no one from that life could reach her. Now they had. The phone was just the beginning. Monday morning arrived grey and cool. Danielle walked Emma to Norfolk Elementary, their hands linked like it was habit rather than reassurance, both of them quiet, the rhythm of their footsteps the only conversation they needed. The school was 6 blocks from their apartment, a walk they made 5 days a week without speaking, a rhythm so established that it required no language. As they approached the crosswalk near the main entrance, Emma said something Danielle hadn't expected. "Mom, it's not fair." Danielle squeezed her daughter's hand. "A lot of things aren't fair, baby." She was about to say more, about to offer the tired wisdom that life wasn't fair and that people had to be stronger for it, when the sound arrived. It wasn't a sound so much as a presence, a bass frequency you felt in your chest before your ears registered it. The rotor wash of helicopter blades cutting through Norfolk morning air. The sound hit like a pressure wave, flattening the grass on the athletic field adjacent to the school, scattering backpacks from where students had dropped them. Parents screamed. Children froze. Danielle's entire body went rigid, her hand still locked with Emma's. 3 black SUVs, government plates, braked hard at the intersection 30 yards away. The helicopter descended, a UH-60 Black Hawk, military designation and grace, the kind of aircraft that only appeared in disaster movies or nightmares. The rotors pushed wind hard enough to knock a bicycle over. Parents pulled their children back from the crosswalk. Teachers emerged from the school's main entrance, their voices swallowed by the mechanical roar. A man in a navy dress uniform stepped from the lead SUV, and even at this distance, Danielle recognized the bearing of a SEAL commander, the way he moved like someone for whom violence was a language he'd spoken fluently for 30 years. He scanned the crowd of parents and children with the precision of someone running facial recognition in his head. His voice, when it came, carried across the chaos with the authority of parade ground commands. "I'm looking for Senior Chief Ross." The words landed like a verdict. Danielle's vision narrowed. Her hands went cold. Emma's hand went rigid in hers. The little girl turned to stare up at her mother with an expression Danielle would never forget: confusion, fear, and something that looked like betrayal. "Mom, what's Senior Chief?" Danielle couldn't answer. The world was collapsing. The invisible life was over. The 7-year architecture of silence had just been demolished by a UH-60 and 3 government vehicles, and the only word that came to her mind was single, simple, final, no. But it was already too late for no. 1 week later, Danielle walked Emma to school like it was any other Tuesday morning, her hand steady in her daughter's, her mind already running through the shift she'd picked up at a clinic across town, a fresh start, a place where no one knew her name. The September air smelled like rain coming, that copper scent before a storm, and the neighborhood was quiet except for sprinklers and a neighbor's dog barking 3 houses down. Emma was talking about a math test, something about fractions, the kind of normal conversation that had kept Danielle anchored for 14 years. Then the sound changed. Not the screaming kind of sound that made her hand move to phantom weapons that weren't there anymore. Worse. The deep mechanical throb of a UH-60 Black Hawk helicopter descending low enough to shake the trees, rotors beating the air like something alive was being crushed from above. 3 black SUVs with government plates turned onto Dogwood Lane simultaneously, moving with the precision of a tactical unit, and Danielle's entire body went cold. Not fear. Recognition. The specific kind of recognition that meant the wall she'd built for 7 years had just been dynamited from the outside. Emma's hand gripped hers tighter. "Mom, what?" A Navy SEAL commander stepped out of the lead SUV before it had fully stopped, tall enough that his head was framed in the helicopter's wash, his uniform bearing the insignia of Naval Special Warfare Command, and his eyes found Danielle's across 30 feet of suburban asphalt with the precision of someone reading a targeting scope. "Senior Chief Ross." His voice carried across the street like he'd called it across a runway. Not a question. A confirmation. Not a request. A command. Around them, neighbors emerged from houses, phones already in hands. Mrs. Chen from next door stood on her porch. The mailman froze mid-route. A woman jogging past the elementary school fence slowed and stared. Danielle could feel the weight of being seen, really seen, for the first time in 7 years, and it felt like being flayed open in the middle of Dogwood Lane with an audience. Emma's voice was small, confused. "Mom, what's Senior Chief?" The commander closed the distance in 4 strides, and Danielle recognized the bearing, the same bearing she'd carried into Baghdad 22 years ago. He extended a classified file folder, manila, an official, the kind that meant nothing good. "I need you to come with me, Em. Your country needs you again." He said it quietly, to her alone, but the words carried. Everything carried now. Danielle opened the file with hands that did not shake, a skill learned in dust and blood and screaming that transcended 3 years of invisibility. The first page showed a photograph of the deaf veteran she'd helped during his panic attack, the one whose name she'd never even learned. His face had changed in the file photo, older, harder, bearing the weight of things he'd seen. Next to his photo were notes in military shorthand: subject recovered unit patch from nurse's locker. 3rd Special Forces Group insignia, faded. Cross-referenced. Below that, Corporal Brennan Hayes' name. The Army medic. The one who'd watched her insert the central line with techniques that only existed in classified combat trauma protocols. His statement was concise: modified Seldinger with precision rotation consistent with airborne surgical training. Baghdad 2002 to 2004. This medic is Legend 6. Confirmed. The next page made her chest tighten. A CIA operative named Thomas Garrett. Dying. Liver failure, maybe cancer. The medical notes were sparse. But the classified section, the part she could read through the redactions, indicated that Thomas Garrett's intelligence operation in Baghdad had prevented something. The text was sanitized, but the impact was clear: lives saved. Catastrophe prevented. Unknown to the public. And then the note: operative demanding Senior Chief Ross oversee post-operative care, Walter Reed Medical Center. Considers this a condition of survival. The commander's jaw had set into a line like reinforced concrete. He saved your life once. Now you save his. That's how it works. The folder felt light in her hands but massive in its implications. 3 years of anonymity. 7 years of being invisible. All of it gone. All of it exposed on Dogwood Lane in front of neighbors and a news van that had already pulled up at the street corner, cameras rolling. Emma was crying without sound, the way she'd learned to cry when Danielle came home screaming from nightmares about Fallujah and Ramadi. The SEAL commander raised his voice just enough for it to carry across the street, across the gathering crowd, into the phones being held up to record. Senior Chief Petty Officer Danielle Ross. Your official honors, pending full declassification, 3 Navy Commendation Medals. He paused. Emma's hand found Danielle's. 2 Bronze Stars. Another pause. The neighbors had gone quiet. Even the helicopter rotors seemed to pause. 1 Bronze Star with Valor device. His eyes held hers. And service to your country that this moment does not allow me to fully describe. Your country needs you again. Danielle felt the mask she'd worn slip away entirely, and she nodded. Subtle. Military. Decisive. Behind them, in the distance, more sirens. Police and fire responding to the helicopter. Behind them, the news van's door was already opening. This was happening now. This was real now. And then the phone calls began. At Mercy General, in the hospital administrator's office, Gerald Strickland watched the same scene unfold on a news feed, his face draining of color. Janet Moorhead, the external investigator, had already sent him a message, "You need to see this." What he saw was a decorated veteran, a decorated medic, being publicly honored while the hospital that had fired her was watching in real time. The optics were not just bad. The optics were catastrophic. By noon, the State Medical Board was examining something else entirely, security footage. All of it preserved. Marcus Webb, the hospital's IT administrator and a Marine Corps veteran who'd watched Hargrove's harassment escalate for 3 years, had saved every frame. The cafeteria tray falling. The chart hitting the floor. Hargrove's smile. All of it preserved. All of it documented. All of it reported to the State Board that morning, before the news helicopters arrived. The state opened an investigation into workplace harassment and abuse of authority by 2 p.m. Hargrove's phone rang at 2:22 p.m. with a reporter from the Virginian Pilot asking for comment about allegations he targeted a veteran nurse. He hung up. The story ran anyway. Patients began calling to cancel appointments at 3:15 p.m. 2 residents filed formal complaints about Hargrove's treatment at 4:08 p.m., emboldened by coverage they'd seen. Tyler Brennan's parents, the 17-year-old whose chest had been filling with blood, released a statement, "The nurse who saved our son's life was punished for it. We are grateful she exists." The story went viral at 6:43 p.m. By midnight, Hargrove's wife found him in his home office, staring at his phone as his reputation disintegrated across social media in real time. At 1:17 a.m., the hospital board chairman called, "Effective immediately, you're on administrative leave pending investigation. Do not contact anyone at Mercy General." 72 hours later, the state medical board suspended his license. Not permanently. Not yet. But suspended. Pending full review of the harassment allegations, the deletion of evidence, and 3 other nurses who'd come forward, 3, all with similar stories spanning 5 years. His attorney said the board connections wouldn't help. That he was toxic. That he should consider a settlement and career change. 6 months later, Danielle stood in her Navy dress uniform at Walter Reed Medical Center, her ribbons and medals visible for the first time in 3 years, overseeing the post-operative care of Thomas Garrett. His hand gripped hers as he recovered, and he whispered words she let herself believe, "I never forgot. The medic who kept me breathing." Emma sat in the visitor area wearing a t-shirt that said, "My mom is a hero," finally understanding the scars and the nightmares and the way her mother flinched at sirens. She'd started asking questions Danielle could finally answer. And across town in a strip mall between a vape shop and a tax service, Dr. Hargrove sat at a folding table with a banner that read supplemental insurance enrollment, explaining deductibles to people who walked past without making eye contact. His hands trembled as he straightened his brochures. A former colleague passed by. Saw him. Looked away quickly. On the Walter Reed lawn, Danielle stood with Emma watching the sunset, and her daughter asked, "Are you going back to the Navy?" Danielle shook her head. "I'm going back to nursing." But not hiding anymore. As they walked to the car, Danielle said quietly, "You do not need a badge or a gun to be a warrior." The camera held on her face, calm, steady, no longer invisible. If this resonates with you, subscribe to our channel and hit the notification bell so you never miss a story like this. Drop a comment below telling us what you think Danielle should do next, and like this video if you believe in standing up for what's right, even when the cost is everything.